Good evening, everyone. Hello, hi. So we're here today to have the ICOMOS Philippines webinar, and we will be discussing placemaking and food security. We have a couple of people who will be joining us from different sectors of the heritage community. And I'm very, very happy to be here because this is a first conversation that we're having for ICOMOS and in relation to the pandemic. Now, before we begin, I would like to introduce the ICOMOS president, Ms. Tina Paterna, who will be giving us a couple of words. Tina?
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us early on this Saturday evening. Thank you to all our speakers, all of you ICOMOS members. We're glad you made time. You're all at different time zones. I think we have a lot of people tonight also because it's a not so explored topic. And let me just give a bit of a background on how we got to exploring the link to food security. This is a result of a small focus group discussion that we had among members early on during the lockdown. And we were exploring issues on how heritage might remain relevant in these times. And a way to explore it is how to link it to national priorities, like in this case, food security. So eventually we worked towards an answer. Can heritage be part of recovery? That's eventually where we want to get through these exploratory talks on issues that emerged in our first discussion. So thank you again for being here. And we look forward to you, the audience, sharing your thoughts also with us. So floor to you, Gab.
Thanks, Tina. So before we start off our presentation, I would just like to introduce what is ICOMOS. So ICOMOS is an international NGO that works for the conservation and protection of cultural heritage places. It is a network of 10,000 expert members from 132 countries, represented through national committees and international scientific committees that contribute to improving preservation of the world's heritage sites. The Philippine National Committee of ICOMOS, which we are part of, is composed of professionals who are part of the heritage conservation practice, and it is geared towards providing and facilitating necessary information transfer and exchange to help the preservation movement progress. It also aims to make heritage conservation a mainstream sustainable development issue. ICOMOS in the Philippines, we have a lot of different activities. One of the recent discussions that we've had, and I think Tina has already mentioned it, is the heritage practice amidst COVID-19, wherein a lot of us discussed on what can be potentially the contributions of heritage professionals during the pandemic. Aside from that, we also have other projects before and events, including the pre-disaster and recovery planning workshop, which we did with the Intramurals administration. We also had an international field school where we partnered with Metrobank Foundation, and which we created like digital maps of heritage sites, and scholarships were available for that one. So keep tabs of what we're doing because there are potential scholarships for students. We also partner with other organizations like the Philippine Association of Landscape Architects in a previous event called Biodiversities and the Sustainability of Historic Plazas. And at one time, we had the privilege of hosting the ICOMOS president, Toshiyuki Kono, who is from Japan, who has provided us a couple of talks for the last 2 years. So we have a lot of activities and events, so please do join us in our future events. We would like to engage with you. So I know that we have two platforms with us. One is in Zoom and another one is in Facebook. So for us who see you out, you see us out there, say hello to us. We really want to know what you think about how heritage is related to food security. I think this is a topic that we have been thinking of, and some of us have been doing more than others, but do share with us your ideas. If you have some case studies in mind, or in your hometown there's something that is going on, please do. You can ask us questions, give us comments on Facebook on the relevant information that we will be sharing here. If you can, just introduce yourself to us, put your name in, and also where you come from or institutes that you come from, and then give us a question. The third one is that for our ICOMOS members in the chat box, please also provide your questions to us. We would be happy to give the floor to you at a later stage. And we are all muted while the conversations are happening so that our three participants or like presenters will be happy to explain what their thoughts are. Let me just do an introduction of our speakers. We have three very well-known speakers here, from which you've probably heard from previous heritage seminars in various places. The first one is Dr. Fernando Nakpil Zialcita, who is a professor emeritus teaching at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Ateneo de Manila University. Sorry. He writes about the interface between Southeast Asia and the Hispanic worlds in the domains of Filipino culture, such as traditional architecture, cookery, and popular Christianity. He has also done field studies among farming communities in the Ilocos, Northern Luzon, and has done studies in the urban heritage and regeneration of Manila. Next one is Miss Patricia Maria Santiago, who is a cultural manager with 25 years of experience, who sits on the board of Nayong Pilipino Foundation. She is part of the Sustainable Sagada, an online support market for local produce of farmers from the Sagada, which aims to help bring local produce to reach consumers in Manila to support their sustainability, not only during the times of economic crisis, but even beyond. The third speaker is Ms. Estela Duque, who is an architect, historian, and social entrepreneur, certified chocolate taster and chocolate competition judge in Europe. A practitioner based in the United Kingdom, she founded Moulinet Chocolat Limited in the UK in 2015 in order to introduce Philippines' specialty cocoa in the world. And since 2017, she has been an advisor to the only craft chocolate event in the Philippines, now called Intramurals Chocolate Festival. So for me, my name is Gabriel Caballero, and I'm part of ICOMOS Philippines as the communications officer. And I'm currently based in Singapore as a landscape architect and also an independent World Heritage specialist. I'll be moderating our conversations for today. From this point on, I will be handing you to our esteemed colleagues, and this one, I will hand it over to Estela. Estela, please.
I'd like to thank Gabrielle for that very good introduction to the group, to the topic, and to our president as well. Now, I would like to first set the framework for everybody in this talk, and I would like not only to introduce the topic, but how we go about dealing with them. So with reference to the pandemic, I would just like to say that one of the important outcomes of that is the singularity of this experience for us, and that it forced us to acknowledge certain things about ourselves, what is essential for survival. One of the important answers is food, but actually not only food, we need shelter, we need medicine. Now, the two things, food and shelter, actually come together in terms of culture. And that talks about tangible and intangible aspects of culture. And we will deal with that in this talk in three different topics. So we are looking at food, the environment, and the culture that binds both. And within food, we are looking at systems. So we're looking at farming systems. We are looking at processing of food so that they become edible for us. And not only that, we look at the distribution channels, but also the way that we consume it. Because these are the important parts wherein we begin to understand why we need to intervene if we have to make relations equitable. So in terms of environment, we have both the landscape, and that includes the farms, but not just that, we are looking at, for example, World Heritage sites that are essentially tied with food production as well. And this is very important for the Philippines. And then we are looking also at how tourism is implicated in the bigger framework. Why is food sometimes also tied to tourism as a form of consumption? And without further ado, we will move to the first part, and we will look at food security and climate change. After that, we will look at history as a framework and context. And finally, how tourism is implicated. So in the first part, we are looking at the idea of food security and looking at definitions that are useful to that. And I turn over the floor to the two speakers.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. Now, I would like to locate the pandemic crisis within a larger crisis. Please don't get me wrong. The pandemic crisis is really very serious. In fact, it hasn't peaked yet. However, let us not forget the larger crisis that is going to affect food security and cultural heritage too. And that is the climate crisis, because the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is warning that we're actually reaching a tipping point by 2030. If we don't maintain temperatures at 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we're going to see more melting of the ice, of the glaciers, stronger storms, prolonged droughts, and this, of course, will affect both cultural heritage and food security. So let's keep that in mind too. Can we hear from Tracy?
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'd like to define or discuss what food security means, especially during this time of the pandemic. I think one of the major realizations that we had during the lockdown in Luzon was that NCR lacked the urban gardens that was needed to feed millions of Filipinos on a lockdown. People rushed to supermarkets to get their supplies of food, but one thing that was scarce was really vegetables coming from the regions, particularly in the Cordilleras and the lowland provinces of Luzon. So while the NCR lacked the sufficient supply of vegetables, some provinces in the Cordillera were throwing away vegetables because there were limited ways to bring them down to Manila, and it wasn't really about the oversupply. So that's where we saw the problem in the supply chain and market distribution and challenges in implementing government support for farmers and food producers to achieve what we call food security. So what is food security? According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, it exists when all people at all times, especially during this pandemic, I think this pandemic is the extreme situation now, have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So with this definition, we look at how we are now in our own communities and as a country, and how we see that we can ask ourselves, do we have this food security based from this definition? And if food sovereignty is as a primary framework, it guarantees that the mass of food producers such as farmers, farm workers, fisher folk, women, and indigenous communities have enough productive resources to achieve food security. I think this definition is quite clear to everyone, to all of us, based on how we are experiencing this pandemic, both from the perspective of the farmers, the food producers, and the consumers like us.
Looking at this one, maybe we just keep it a little bit longer here because we want people to see what this is about. But concluding from this first part, I would like to just say, before we move to the next one, that we are looking at three different things here. We are looking at the idea of food security, where all the stakeholders have access physically and economically to food for survival. We are looking at food sovereignty, and this is really the contrast between the community as opposed to the corporate sector. What we need to guarantee is the producers themselves also have access to this food, as opposed to global chains and long market institutions that have a global reach. And then finally, we want to look at distribution. So we're looking at the issue of domestic markets and export markets. And we're going to deal with the idea of terroir and how to apply that to the Philippines in the first instance. And then we are going to look at the local markets and finally the idea of organic certification, both for the local market and overseas. So I'd like to invite, I think Dr. Zialcita?
Yes, thank you. Going back to global warming, one reason for global warming is, of course, the massive deforestation that's taking place all over the world. There's a tendency to homogenize the landscape. As a response to that, we really should preserve biodiversity, the different niches, the different ecosystems all over the world. Now, central to that concept is the French concept of terroir, which I find quite relevant, both to other countries as well as to the Philippines. Why so? When you talk about terroir, you're talking about a particular ecosystem. That's the product of the soil, the topography, the climate, the microclimate in that particular area, and water allocation. And that is connected also with local cultural practices that are found nowhere else in the world. Now, that is so very important because it compels us to respect the uniqueness of a particular niche in the world instead of wanting to homogenize it. It also creates a niche for our farmers so that they can sell products at a premium price that will not be wiped out by cheaper prices from elsewhere.
Tracy?
Yeah. Well, in terms of what is happening now in with the Cordillera farmers with the pandemic, we have identified. We are trying to identify the current markets of these vegetables. Well, current markets. What we see now is that a big market is NCR, the National Capital Region. But expanding this, now we see different households because before they were directly dealing with traders, middlemen. So now the market has expanded to the different households through different platforms of marketing. And I guess, well, this is actually a positive effect of this pandemic in terms of marketing. But I think there are still gaps and there are still much support that is needed from the government that can be done to be able to fulfill this or achieve this for the farmers.
Right. So in this photograph, before we change it, I just wanted to show that there are three images here which show the kind of systems that are in place already in the Philippines. We have EcoCert and we have OCCP. And we also have an international one represented in the Philippines, which is CERES. And these are organic certification systems which we can take in order to show that the products are actually really certifiable. Now, why is that important? It's one of the ways that we can ensure sustainability. Why? Because these systems respect, the loop wherein the production of the goods, the food and all that actually takes into consideration the environment as well. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to mention here very briefly that we can look at sustainability in terms of transparency and traceability in a little bit more detail. And I'd like to invite Dr. Zialcita to say something about fair trade. And Tracy after that.
I think a true appreciation for food should take into consideration how food is produced in the first place. I think it's difficult to enjoy food that is a product also of unfair labor practices. We have to think of what's going on the ground level among the farmers.
Yeah, I agree, totally agree with Dr. Zialcita. There are certain fair trade principles that we can actually follow. Number one would really be the respect for the environment. We really need to be connected to the land, not just the people, not just the farmers, but be able to protect the land. And one fair trade principle that's very important is that. And another one would be really being able to pay a fair price to the farmers, to our producers. So that's very important in terms of sustainability and especially transparency. That gives a better, or actually you give the best quality of products if you are able to follow those fair trade principles. But I think in the Philippines, there are very few products or fair trade certified products that are certified. So with chocolate, I think there are already fair trade products that are happening and being done by producers.
Yeah. So before we finish with this one, I'd just like to point out that, as Tracy has said, there is an important part to be played by consumer education here, because we have to show, we have to teach the consumers themselves how to differentiate between, for example, industrially produced goods, artisanal goods which respect the makers. And all these things happen in a variety of venues, including trade fairs, festivals, and that also brings into the equation the issue of international tourism, which we'll deal with a little bit more later. So this image on the right is just what to show you that, in fact, the Philippines has arrived in the international scene. And I can say that I'm very proud that several companies have been at Chocolat this year, and we look forward to more events like that. And if we turn to the next slide, we will look at how history plays a part into planning this future for us, for food security. So we need to understand what it is, this heritage that we are looking at, and why we need to look at it. What are the components of this? We're looking at branding as a means of involving the community of producers and the people who make the finished product, but also we're looking at supply chains. Supply chains brings us to the different agents. And so the next part, we would like to ask the, Tracy, I think you would like to talk about something?
Yes, I'd like to talk about indigenous culinary identities and food mapping. Why is it important for us to do a food mapping? What is a food mapping? It's actually a documentation of our culinary or actually our resources, our culinary resources, all the ingredients that we have in the community. It is also, it's more like a part of the IKSP, or in the indigenous knowledge systems and practices in agriculture. And a lot of these resources are kept by the elders, kept by the communities, and which is actually should be shared to the next generation. But what is happening right now is that a lot of the younger generation, especially in the Cordilleras, lose this interest in farming. So they leave the communities and find another career, and they leave the farms. And so the knowledge system in terms of their culinary identity is losing. So that's one of the challenges now. But that is also one opportunity during this pandemic for these communities to be able to do this, to be able to start with their indigenous knowledge systems and practices to be shared to the communities, especially to the younger generation, through education.
I just wanted to show you this one because one of the issues we're dealing with is the difference between monocropping and multicropping. And this is very important because when we do monocropping, it means that if this monocrop fails, then the food producers, the farmers, are at the mercy of the market. It means that they cannot eat, and unless there are other alternatives available for them, then there will be a network of events that will impact on the consumers themselves. Now, if we have, on the other hand, multicropping, we have other food products that are available to them while the main crop is being, they're waiting for the main harvest to come through. And I just wanted to show you this because one of the companies that I deal with has 14 different products, which means at any time of the year, there's always something to harvest and something to eat. And I do understand that this is a question of market forces, but we need to recognize that so that the farmers themselves will get the help that they need in order to move forward with multicropping. Now, moving on to the next stage. Another area we need to look at is intangible heritage. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Zialcita to tell us more about this in terms of contexts of particular areas in the world, like the production of...
Yes, I wanted to talk about intangible heritage precisely in relation to terroir and the protection of biodiversity. A very good example of this is the very expensive bubbly called champagne, which actually is protected by French and European law. Any bubbly produced outside the province of Champagne in northeastern France cannot be called champagne. Okay, so you can produce a bubbly in southern France. It will not be allowed to be called champagne. Let me just show you why. Okay, I mentioned that terroir is a product of both the land, nature, and cultural practices. Champagne is a prestigious drink, and yet it is produced on very poor soil. It's a combination actually of 3 grapes produced on land that is very poor in quality, limestone. You can see the limestone cliffs of Champagne. At the same time, the climate is actually horrible because you have 2 cold fronts colliding here, the Atlantic and the continental. So the winters are bitter. But that is precisely what produces a great flavors that are astringent, which is perfect for champagne. You cannot have champagne that is sweet. So, so to produce champagne, actually, you first produce wine that's still, and then to make it bubbly, you have to ferment it a second time by inserting yeast, sugar. Now, the process by which this is done can be done mechanically now, of course, but French law insists that it has to be done manually using traditional practices. I will not go into the process itself because we don't have time, but I just want to point out that the concept of terroir in Europe actually protects the local farmer. It protects heritage. It also protects the landscape. Yeah. Okay, we have not yet appreciated the value of terroir in the Philippines because we tend to think of the countryside as homogeneous. In fact, it is diverse. And I think for our own protection, for the protection of our farmers, we should start classifying the Philippines in terms of different ecosystems, in terms of different terroir that are combinations of both nature and culture. To give an example, it is unfortunate that we don't appreciate terroir in the making of Lambanog. Lambanog originated in the province of Quezon, formerly called Tayabas. The water that is used for that issues from the sides of Mount Banahaw, so it's clear mountain water. At the same time, we have to appreciate the fact that the making of Lambanog is actually a very risky process. First, you have to cross from one coconut tree to the other. Then you have to bend the flower of the coconut tree, and then you have to do that every day until finally the sap comes out. Now, so first you make tuba, and then after tuba has been made, then you boil it, you distill it to extract the humors, and then finally the humors, the vapors become what is called lambanog. It's a very delicate process. Unfortunately, because of lack of proper certification, grading, quality is uneven, sometimes even dangerous. But it is a good example actually of terroir.
There, I'd like to discuss further about the IKSP, or the Indigenous Knowledge System and Practices in agriculture. But I'd like to cite a case of Hapao in Ifugao, and it was shared by the principal of Hapao Elementary School. Their observations were that the IKSP, or the Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices, is recognized internationally and at the national level. However, it is not being given priority in the local educational system, which blocked recognition of indigenous culture. The Ifugao children became oblivious of the rich culture, folk songs, even the stone walling of the terraces, handcrafting and woodwork, rice farming, etc. The ideal development view that prevails in the educational system remains to be Western in nature, where education is equated as with progress and civilization. The indigenous knowledge is viewed as obsolete, backward, compared to the Western educational system. The primary learners were taught Western literature. For example, for starters, they read about Cinderella and Snow White, and thus became ignorant of epics like the Hudhud. They were taught about pyramids, but not educated about the wooden houses or of massive cultural significance of the Ifugao. So they had an initiative in at the elementary school of integrating the IKSP to the educational system of Hapao. Number one is for the use of localized materials in explaining lessons. For example, a reference to rice fields as example instead of malls or zoos or parks that are dominant in printed books. Second was the integration of the IKSP in curriculum preparation. For example, in the agriculture as a way of life, the integration of folk songs and rituals, teaching of terracing and stone walling lessons. Third is the making of contextualized materials. And fourth, holding of activities in relation to the IP celebration for them to learn and pass this on to the next generation.
Right. So for my part, I'd just like quickly to talk about how this is applied in Mindanao, in particular in South Cotabato, where I do a lot of my work. And here we are looking at the case study of Cablon Farms in South Cotabato and how we've been able to achieve a kind of relationship with the terroir through Mount Matutum. Because Mount Matutum is the most prominent geographical element in the environment, which dictates the soil. And the farm is just at the base of it. And so based on that, the idea is that, including, of course, the microclimate, the microorganisms that do the fermentation for the farm, all these are taken into account when we create the fermentation protocols for this particular, let's say, origin. So we're talking about origin cacao, which respects the place. And what we do is we move through the entire supply chain by working with a fermentation scientist. We work with specific chocolate makers, craftsmen, and then we also work with these people on the distribution side in Europe in order to have a closer relationship to understand how it is here in the Philippines that we can produce something that is useful to them, and how do we move forward and improve the products. Now, this relationship is not yet as developed in the Philippines because the problem is the consumer does not recognize the importance of the origin chocolate. Right now, a lot of the tablea that we still consume is not fermented, which means also that it could be, a lot of it could be burnt when we process it. And so we have to take into consideration the bigger picture when we move forward with the idea of terroir, because in fact, it doesn't actually come from the Philippines itself. So let's move to the next slide, please. The idea of branding. And I just want to talk about a couple of slides here, a couple of photos that I put here. And this is the idea of Vietnam cacao as it has been developed by the various agencies there. So these two pictures that I'm showing you comes from the brand Maru Cacao. Now, Maru Cacao is actually owned by two Frenchmen who now live in Vietnam. And what they've done is, together with the Vietnamese farmers, other stakeholders, like other chocolate makers as well, is actually to highlight the importance of the idea of origin. And they have six origins that they recognize. And when you buy these chocolates everywhere, whether you're in the United States, in Europe, or say, for example, in Singapore, what you see is the recognition of the differences in the flavor. And this goes back to what Dr. Zialcita was saying about, you know, how important it is for the conditions on the ground to dictate the taste. And with that setting, I'd like to turn over the idea of branding to Dr. Zialcita.
This kind of chocolate that I will be discussing is not really the kind of chocolate that Estela is referring to. It's not premium Vietnamese chocolate. It's not Maru. It's really very ordinary Vietnamese chocolate. But I couldn't resist by bringing this into this forum because it's an example of how architectural heritage is used to create a story for a chocolate tradition that is really fairly new and not so known in the world. I actually bought this package about 15 years ago in Saigon. It's interesting that, you know, the Vietnamese have fought against French colonialism, and yet what they feature on this package is actually architectural legacy from the French colonial period. It's the famous Hotel de Ville, the city hall of Saigon, which is now the headquarters of the Communist Party in the South. So they're using French legacy to say that, hey, we can produce quality chocolates because we have learned many things from the French. The second proper I'm referring to here is from Bohol. Again, it has nothing to do with quality chocolates. These are, I think, chocolate kisses for which Bohol is famous. It's interesting how Boholanos have decided to create an image for their wrappers by bringing in architectural heritage. They brought in this famous triangular footed Santa Cruz watchtower, which overlooks the coast of Bohol to protect them from raiders before. So they use it to attract the buyer by showing them something different.
Stella, yes, I would just like to add for in the Philippine context of what we can do in terms of branding. We can create, possibly we can create a local certification for identity branding. And that could be a grassroots type of certification, because like, for example, with organic vegetables, there is a certain process and association or group that certifies this, the vegetables. Or for example, with fair trade, there are really people or groups of people who certifies for fair trade. But for example, for products or for food in the regions per town, we can do, what they can do is that they can do a local certification, a grassroots certification that can be led by the local government, the trade office of the local government, but in collaboration and in consultation with the farmers and the processors and other food producers. And the local certification can be based from a set of standards that is culture-based and community-based. For example, standards can be set by the community or by that group from the community based from facets of cultural worth, so that it can be unique from their town. One would they can look at originality. Is it the first of its kind? Is it, they can look at indigenousness, if it's original or native to that place, to their community. They can also look at the authenticity or the purity or genuineness of these food products. Fourth would be uniqueness, if it's the only one of its kind. Historicity is very important, like with the example of Dr. Zialcita. They used these French influence or French architecture in Vietnam as part of their packaging or branding. Magnitude, the superlative degree or the extent or the quantitatively if it's quantitatively measured. And last would be excellence or greatness, if their products are really of excellence and greatness compared to other products of other towns.
Thank you very much, Tracy. So now you're getting an idea of the basic principles of branding, and now Tracy has given us the a kind of bare bones of what needs to be recognized in terms of the framework. And I just want to show you now briefly a kind of very specific example, because we have actually done this in the Philippines. We have two experts. Their names are, I should mention them now, because I'm sure that people who are very interested in this, we want to know more about who they are and how they can get in touch with them in the future. They are Patrick Belisario, who is also part of EcoCert, an organic certifier for trade association in the Philippines, and Peter Damry, who is actually based in Davao, and who was part of RED, R-E-D-D, and this was the agency that helped the Philippines to move forward with the 10 products that are actually already certified as kind of terroir products for us, or origin-linked products in English, but also the other names, and this is what I use in Europe, because once I say it to them, they know straight away. For the French, it's Appellation d'origine contrôlée, or the Dénomination d'origine for the Spaniards. And this is, the framework for this is around World Intellectual Property Organization. And they're the ones who develop for us our participation as part of the third world, accessing a bigger market. But that process itself is actually not easy. So we have to consider, in order to move forward, what are the processes that we needed to fulfill? What are the certifications we need to provide? And for cacao, which is the example that we're dealing with, I list here a list of key issues that we need to present to the market for us to move forward this kind of certification. Although it hasn't happened yet, we're certainly aware of it. So we have to deal with mass collection, the wet mass, and then we have to provide fermentation protocols as the intellectual property owned by the farmers. And the next one, we have to deal with storage and security, because if we don't have the volume to sell afterwards, even if we have the intellectual property, then we're on the losing side. And then for that, we have the systems of traceability and transparency. And I'm trying to work with 3 regions right now. So South Cotabato is the most successful one. And then we're trying to bring in Cordillera cacao and also Bohol cacao. So now supply chains in history, we would like to see how we can use historical examples to understand how supply chain actually works, because there are certain interventions that we can do throughout it in order to improve the supply chain. And I'd like to turn over the forum to Dr. Zialcita, who will talk about Intramurals.
Well, actually, I wanted to point out that actually food security has formed part of our history. It also has direct connection with architectural heritage. Not too many realize that actually, although our ancestors knew 2 types of rice planting, the more prevalent type was actually shifting cultivation or Sweden. They also knew wet rice cultivation, but that's hard to it's hard to use if you're living on a hilly ground. Most of the Philippines tends to be hilly and deeply forested. So they would use wet rice cultivation largely on the shores of bodies of water like Laguna de Bay, which flooded annually. But otherwise, they preferred to use kaingin, which means clearing a patch of the forest, burning that patch of the forest and planting different crops at different times using a stick. Now, the problem with that, although it does guarantee food, is that people live in dispersed settlements. So the missionaries found it very difficult to preach the gospel to dispersed settlements of people living in just 5 households per settlement. So they decided to teach them with the help of Chinese converts how to use the plow, the Chinese plow hitched to the carabao. Now, surprisingly, Intramurals has a part to play here because the iron plowshares were actually forged in the Royal Foundry in Intramuros. So there's a connection. Now, the other thing too that connects Intramuros, for example, food security and the rest of the country, are root crops. Because rice, as you know, before the invention of miracle rice in the 70s, has only one crop season per year. So what do you plant the rest of the year? Well, our ancestors had root crops, but the missionaries supplemented this with camote from Mexico and corn also from Mexico.
Next slide, please.
There you are. Camote and corn, yeah.
Tracy?
Well, I would just like to give an example of Sagada with what is happening now. This is more like a current situation of Sagada. Pre-COVID or pre-pandemic, what they have been doing is that they are dealing with traders. And not just traders, they bring the farmers would bring their produce to the trading posts, or they just sell it to the community. So that's how they sell their products. But now, what they do is that they try to send their vegetables directly to the consumers in Manila through an online platform, which I will discuss later on. But because this is just a start for them, what happens is that there are still a lot of produce that's being left in the community because the market has not yet been fully explored especially in Manila. So one of the possibilities that will eventually happen to their produce would be a farm-to-bottle solution. A lot of instead of throwing away the vegetables, like for example, the bell peppers or the tomatoes, what they are already looking at is processing it into bottled tomato sauce or bottled products that they can they can process and also sell it as a product for them. So now they're looking at the future. They're planning for future marketing of their products so that nothing goes to waste, and they don't suffer the choice of just giving it to the traders or the middlemen at a very, very low price. So now they're looking at their products. They're planning it into a more of a high value product of the community.
Thank you, Tracy. Right. So actually, that was a very good example that Tracy gave about the idea of helping the farmer to create a new product, which is the finished product, so that if the fresh produce is not sold, then it doesn't go to waste. Now, I just wanted to show you this image because this is actually what the supply chain looks like for a very complex product like cacao and chocolate. So once it leaves the farm, there's a huge number of players, logistics companies that go in between before it reaches the consumer itself in terms of bulk chocolate. And this particular one is very complex, and it doesn't put the farmer in the equation, because once the produce has left the farm, that's it. Now, what we want to do is get away from this, and please show the next slide. And what we want to do is to compress everything so that we have a more direct trade between the farmer and the maker, and also that we try to minimize the impact of the middleman on the profit, so that a lot of the profits or most of it will go to the farmer. So if we can go to the next slide. So what is the role of the different sites, for example, that we have in terms of this supply chain? We would like to look at World Heritage sites or provincial centers, for example. And I'd like to ask Dr. Zialcita to talk about the differences, for example, between monocropped sites or other sites which have developed in history that have had processes involved.
Okay, monocropping is typical of parts in the Philippines that were dependent on haciendas, particularly sugar. Example would be Silay and Talisay in Negros. Okay, I find those sites important not because of food security, but for something else, namely because those houses respond quite well to global warming. No? They're easy to ventilate. Now, vegan is not really connected with food security, I would think, from what I know, because the wealth of vegan derived from the production and sale of its cotton blankets, which are famous nationally and even in Mexico because of their sturdiness as cotton blankets.
So we're looking now at the tourism sector, which is the last topic that we're going to deal with. And I'd like to call on Dr. Zialcita again in his expertise to actually talk about the origins of some of these ideas coming from Europe before we look at specific examples in the Philippines.
Actually, what we have been doing throughout is really what the French writer Jean-Antoine Brillat-Savarin was advocating, the development of a new science called gastronomy. Gastronomy is not really about just food tasting. It's a science he envisioned that would look into the entire food production process, from the way food is grown, all the way to the way it's transported to the market, the allocation, who owns the land, who benefits from the land, how it is brought to the kitchen, how it is flavored, until finally it is brought to the table. He says that we have to take a look at food. You have to be interested in our food. That's basically what he's saying. Because we have to be responsible for our food. Now, this concept was picked up by Carlo Petrini, founder of Slow Food Movement, who has founded, in fact, an institute for gastronomical sciences in Italy. Again, he advocates the importance of paying attention to how our food is produced. So fairness is important. Sustainability is important.
So I just want to briefly say that, in fact, one of the key problems that we've had with the pandemic is that it stopped logistics of a lot of things, and that includes the distribution of the food. And so we have to look at that as an impact on the production of food and the landscapes that are involved in it. And if we move to the next slide, I'd like to ask Tracy to talk about detail in Sagada.
Yes. Well, like what I mentioned earlier, one of the good things that is happening because of this pandemic is that, for example, for Sagada, before the pandemic happened, they were already suffering from mass tourism. And we have been working with the town, with the LGU in how to manage tourism in the town. But it was so difficult because a lot of the questions of the stakeholders, such as the guides and the innkeepers, would be, where would we be getting our livelihood? We don't want to go back to farming because farming would mean that after we harvest, we would have to wait 4 months to earn again. And there are times that there's, like for example, there's a storm, okay, or a typhoon, and they get locked down. They really have to have enough money to save for the rainy days. So whenever it is a peak season of tourism, they really bank on tourism for the earning of the community. So a lot of these guides and tourism stakeholders used to be farmers. So my question before was, what would happen if I give them a situation? What would happen, or where would you be sourcing your income if, for example, you get locked down, the community for whatever reason gets locked down, and then this pandemic happened, and they get locked down, we get locked down, all the tourists cannot go to Sagada. So now it's just a community working together. It's just a community trying to survive and finding ways how to survive in this pandemic. But fortunately, what is currently happening now is that these guides and tourism stakeholders have started to go back to gardening and farming, because in the time of the pandemic, what provides them food security was farming. So this is what, and aside from this, they have become focused on securing their food and producing food. The effect on the heritage sites of Sagada is that a lot of the sites, especially the caves and the falls and other natural resources, have started to breathe, and they're able to regrow and regenerate now. And even the social values, the community is working together and bonding together in finding ways to be able to secure their needs as a community and not just as individuals. The next slide is, this one is one of the effects of this pandemic. This is called the DAPI. The DAPI was the center of government of the indigenous community of Sagada. So now they are changing from the left picture. The left image is the picture where they were changing the GI sheets roofing of the DAPI, and the image on the right is currently they've already changed it and brought it back to the Kogon roofing that used to be for DAPIs, and they are actually doing the landscaping and clearing the area and making the area and the DAPI as a center of their cultural expression and the center of, because this indigenous system still exists in the community, but because of because of national government and local government, they had a conflict of interests and agendas. Before, the community would just be listening to the DAPI, the elders of the DAPI. Then came the establishment of the local government in the community.
Yes.
So now there is a conflict or a clash. But now it's good that it still exists, but they are now emphasizing or giving more value to the DAPIs. And one of this is really showing that the bringing back the beauty and the expression, the architectural expression of the DAPI, and giving value. What's more important is really giving value to these structures. And this is an effect, a positive effect for the community and tourism.
Which brings us to the next topic, actually, which is a very good segue to it. Right. So this brings us to the role of the state. And I think actually Tracy again, is that right? Probably has a better idea of how this works with the rice terraces.
Mm-hmm. Well, in 2018, the National Anti-Poverty Commission, or NAPC, drafted a master plan along with line agencies, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Agrarian Reform, provincial and local government units, NGOs, and community stakeholders, particularly the IPUs, and created this master plan called the Rice Terraces Rehabilitation and Conservation for Food Security Development Plan for 2019-2023. So, but of course, having this in mind with the master plan, I don't know if the idea of having a pandemic was included in the planning, but I think what's important is that the vision of the master plan, their vision was by 2030, the Cordillera Rice Terraces become sustainable through indigenous knowledge systems and practices for food security. So we're always being brought back to the indigenous knowledge systems and practices of the community, because that was what worked for them before. That was that's the reason why they were able to create the rice terraces. So it's also the same IKSP that's going to be passed on now to the next generation, and that becomes a basis for any planning and decision making that will help manage in the conservation of these heritage sites. So now we see that the importance of food security. If we secure the rice terraces, then we're able to secure not just the heritage sites, but we're able to secure the food for the community and food for us, food for people in Manila who do not have urban gardens at this time.
Right. So now we move on actually to the last bit. We move from the state, which is the macro level, into a big site. And that is the urban heritage that we have. And I just wanted to point out that that there is a big role here for the middle class, because actually it is the middle class which will help to lift the farmer because they have the means to do it. But we have to educate this community so that they will actually do the right thing. And I'd like to also talk about, may I invite Tracy again to talk about how that has happened for the physical market and the online market? Mm-hmm. And before that, we have to do it briefly to let Dr. Zialcita also talk about Intramurals and the urban truck gardens before we finally end.
So when this pandemic started, well, in early April, the local government asked for support, asked for help, because they were already starting to harvest their vegetables. So the problem was that the trading post in La Trinidad was on a lockdown, so that their problem is that they have so many vegetables that they don't want to throw away. So they said that, can you help us market it in Manila? But then I told them that the problem would be transportation. So the Department of Agriculture supported the local government in transporting the vegetables. But before they transported the vegetables, we created this online platform called Sustainable Sagada. And this online platform is an online market that would help sell all the vegetables to the Manila consumers by way of online marketing. So for the first run, we were able to bring down 5.6 tons of vegetables until we reached, after 2.5 months, we were able to sell about a little more than 20 tons of vegetables. But aside from the vegetables, one sector that needed help was the tourism sector, the tourism stakeholders, the inns and the local producers, the processors, the restaurants who were producing the jams, the baked smoked meat in Sagada. So we were also able to help them and to bring down all these products and sell it to Manila. There is a very big potential to bring down these local products, not just for Sagada, but for a lot of regions. Because at the time of a pandemic, it is a challenge for everyone to move around. Tourism is down at this moment, but what we can do is that we can let these products, these produce, travel to where the foot traffic is. Yes. And even after post-pandemic, this is still what we can do. We don't need, we realize that the community do not need the foot traffic for them to be able to sell their produce. Because at this time, they're actually able to sell more than what they were selling before. So what they did was that really to keep producing now and bring those products to where the foot traffic is. And I think it works. It's going to work. It's still tourism, but people experience these places through the local products.
And so yeah, with that we go back full circle from the foot traffic to the food gardens, and we'd like to end with Dr. Zialcita. Next slide, please. We have a very short time left.
Yeah, my suggestion was this. Actually, as I said, food security and the religious orders were closely connected together. So I was suggesting, since most likely some of those convent gardens were not purely ornamental, but served food purposes, why not transform parts of Intramurals into food gardens that can service the community, both intramurals and outside, because we really need to have more gardens sprouting within the city that can produce food for us. Now, I was suggesting also that we could do the same for some of those beautiful gardens in the provinces, like this one, surrounding the Church of Dawis and its watchtower. Why not transform part of it into a vegetable garden that can help the local community? That's all I have to say.
Yeah. So I'd like to turn over the platform to Gab.
Yes, that was quite a lot. I was typing away at the background and really like getting some notes because indeed there are a lot of thoughts that you've provided there. I think as a small summary before I give to our reactors, the idea of branding and champagne and how that is created in France, of course, is so nice. But the question of how can we actually implement it here and the concept of terroir, amazing. But is it something that we have here? I'm not yet sure. Let's discuss that. The idea of the pandemic and how it has started off with shifting the mindsets of people so that it can be more self-reliant is, I think, what Tracy has given us. But how is it sustainable? Is it going to be there for the long run is a question that we have to ask ourselves. I think some of our speaker or some of our reactors are also thinking about that. And then can we bring cultural heritage back? So we have discussed a lot of landscapes and what is relevant to. For more in-depth questions, let me bring up two of our reactors. So we have together with us from our Zoom platform, Chen Mencias, who is an environmental planner, and Andrea Castillo, who is an agroecological farmer. So Chen, do you have any thoughts from what our speakers have mentioned?
Thank you so much for that very informative talk. It's more of a dialogue, actually. A very nice method. I was just thinking about how all these frameworks that has been discussed, especially the one that's happening in Sagada, in Tracy's involvement, can be institutionalized so it can be replicated in other places. Because it's easy to identify local case studies, but how will the national government make sure that this is sustained after COVID? We have many success stories with regards to people's reflection on bringing to light heritage, especially intangible heritage, now that people are gardening, cooking recipes of their parents, of their grandparents. But is it temporary, or can we sustain this after COVID? Are we going back to how it was before? Like in Sagada, we know that they experience mass tourism, and everyone is just blinded by the fact that it's easy to earn from tourism and forget about agriculture. But now it has pushed them to look at their agricultural systems, indigenous knowledge systems, and realize that it's part of their resiliency as people. Same with Batanes and same with other island communities. But you cannot stop people from traveling, and if these communities are not prepared after COVID, when we have the chance to travel already and we have the vaccine, you will see migration of people again to these rural areas, putting them at risk. So they might go back to how it was before. So how do we sustain this shift from having that awareness that it is important for us to hold on to this knowledge system because it's part of our survival?
Thanks, Chen. We both work together for tourism, in the tourism sector, and we both know the challenges. These challenges are very present in a lot of our towns all over the Philippines. For Sagada, they are actually now talking about how to prepare, set guidelines for tourism. One good thing is that pre-COVID, they were able to bring in DENR to help them with the foot traffic that they need for every site. So they will put that in place for when tourism opens. But based from my talks or conversations with some locals, they're really not prepared to open tourism, and they're actually not keen on opening tourism anytime, even after the pandemic, or if there is a vaccine, because now they're experiencing their community, they're experiencing their place. Sabi nila, at night, you know, they experienced Sagada like 30 years ago. So because of that experience, that good experience of the community, they feel that they don't want to go back to how it was before. But they also know that they need to find a way to have an alternative source of income, because they have been so dependent with tourism. And so now they see that agriculture, going back to agriculture, will be able to help them provide for their families and be able to pay for their needs. But one would be really to set the guidelines as a community. What's good is that because of the pandemic, there are not so much distractions in the community. So the ones who are planning and talking is just really the community.
Mm.
May I just add 1 minute reply to that, to just tell them that in terms of the cocoa sector, there is actually we have tried to create the systems that will support this kind of response after the COVID. So this is the idea of terroir in cacao. But what we need is the support of both the DTI and the DA, and for the regional governments not to compete with each other. And by this time, I want to say that actually we want to champion the smallness, because it's the only way that the idea will work in cacao. The idea that the terroir of, for example, South Cotabato should not be in competition with the terroir of Cordillera, because what we want is both to succeed, but to succeed for the small farmers. Because we are actually very problematic with the bulk cacao chain, wherein the profits go primarily to the middleman.
Mm. Our other reactor, somehow she's not in, but maybe I can ask her intervention in her behalf. There was a question from her on the circumvention of middlemen, as Estela was saying, right? In terms of Tracy and Estela, what do you think are means of cutting out that middleman and having that benefit spread more easily to a lot more people? What are the different strategies for that?
Tracy, maybe you go first, because I need the slide.
Yeah, I think a lot of farmers need the support of trainings, post-harvest processes that can be taught to them, direct marketing of the products, of their produce. I think the Department of Agriculture is, well, at this moment, they're already providing a lot of support to the farmers. So, but training them really, because a lot of these farmers, once they harvest, they want the money right away. So they bring it to the trading posts, because once they bring their produce, they know that they can already get hold of the payment, their money. But we also need to, I guess we need to teach them about the whole process from the planting, not just the plant, from the crop programming or crop planning to the planting and the harvesting and the post-harvest. I think we need to teach them or train the farmers to see the whole picture, that so that they know that they are actually a big player in food production and food security. And that way, when we are able to train our farmers, they will be able to, they know how the whole process, the whole flow of the business goes, and they know how to place themselves wherein they will not lose, and they will not just give in to the traders or the middlemen, but they can actually directly do the business and do directly the marketing of their produce. So training is very, very, very important for our communities and for our food producers.
To answer that, could I ask for the slide back and go to number 23? So in order to answer that, I would like you to look at this supply chain photograph. And I'd like to thank Robin Dand for the use of this slide. He's based here in London. And the idea is that, you know, if you look at the blue line, which stretches from the farm to the final consumer at the end, the factory, but also the individuals consuming the product, it's a very long supply chain for this particular example, which is cacao and chocolate. And what we want to do is to actually become aware of how this happens, both from the origin side, which is on the left side divided by the line in the middle, and on the right side, which is the consumption side. And in both sides of the equation, what we have are financial instruments that enable the middleman to make the profit while forcing the origin producers to a minimum of survival. And this is the problem that we have. What we need to do is eliminate as much of this middleman process so that we can give as much of it back to the community that produced the farmer's produce, the cacao in this instance. And so if we go to the next slide, please. What we want to do is remove all of that and then maybe have this 3 or 4 agents. So you have the farmer, you have an organization. If the farmer does not ferment by himself, they use a cooperative post-harvest facility. And then you have in the middle, the importer, who could be functioning as in several functions. So for example, they not only import, they market, and they help to create the product itself. And then you have the manufacturer. And then in this case, if we value smallness, you value the small farmer, then you also value the artisanal product. And this is, you know, this is a collapse of the supply chain, so that most of the profits will go to the end agents, the farmer and the baker on the other side.
That's
so
a good
that's how I would answer.
Yeah. Do we think that we can have some questions from our Facebook?
Yeah, maybe
True.
5 minutes.
Yeah. So our first Facebook question is from Bianco Arco. It is related to food production system. So her question is, how do you balance between preserving indigenous agricultural practices and modernizing the food production system? And she said that innovative agriculture is key to food security and fair trade for farmers. So how do you balance the indigenous practices and modernizing the food production system? So Estela and Doxy, would you have some thoughts on this?
First of all, I think the concept of terroir, if implemented properly, will actually help the farmer, because the problem here is producing enough food that can command a good price in the market. Now, the government really has to do something about creating a certification system nationwide that will protect particular ecosystems in the country. It should so that you cannot just label any wine produced outside Ilocos as basi. Even if it's sugar wine from Cebu, it cannot be classified as basi, cannot be branded. The same way Lambanog can be done anywhere in any coconut producing country, but it has to be labeled Lambanog only if it's done within the southern Tagalog provinces. Now, given that will allow the farmers to use both traditional methods as well as to innovate. Because let's face it, traditional methods are actually laborious because they use a lot of hand skills. Now, labeling will enable the farmers to be guaranteed a good price because they're producing products that are unique.
Yeah. If I answer that, actually, I have to agree with Dr. Zialcita in the sense that this whole system of terroir-based product is actually geared towards the idea of championing the small, because they are artisans in the first place. But the competition of what you're saying as the industrialization of the production is another area which I don't see as actually consistent with this. Of course, you can have innovation in production. So for example, in cacao production, in order to create specialty cacao, what we need is not to make a greater number of fermentation boxes, but to actually have the knowledge of the fermentation and be able to claim that as intellectual property. That is an innovation. And the other thing is that this whole bulk chocolate production, bulk cacao production is not actually to favor the Philippines, but the export market. And who is benefiting from that? It's not actually the Filipinos. It's the world, it's globalization and the international corporate sector that buys it at the lowest possible price. So in that sense, if we champion the small farmer, I think that actually the innovations will come, but we have to be clear first who it is that we're trying to help.
I think because we're 1.5 hours in our conversation, perhaps what I can do is that, Chen, if you have any other thoughts, and then we will have one more question from from Facebook. Chen, do you have any other things that you want to ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to, am I mute? No, okay. I just wanted to say that there's already a pending bill as an amendment to RA 10068, yung Organic Agriculture Act, which highlights the participatory guarantee system, and that's what Tracy was talking about. I think it's going to be a game changer, and this is also where what Estela is talking about, that's where it can come in, this guarantee system. This is actually certification system in the grassroots level, but this is still a bill, but there's a good chance it will be adopted to law. But I think that maybe ICOMOS can be a part of this because you know, usually it's in the implementation part that we encounter a lot of problems. Also, I just want to point out that in Sagada, I know that everywhere, eventually it's the decision of the community that should prevail. However, sometimes the local government has a tendency also not to listen because they're looking at being popular and having tourists and being in the internet, in the magazines and all that, and the write-ups. So what is Sagada doing and to make sure that they don't again get caught in the trap of having too many tourists going up there, not being controlled? Are they going to come up with a statement saying that we don't want tourism here? Because we know that there is a Farm Tourism Act, and this is one way by which the national government is saying that there can be a good mix between farming and tourism. So is that being considered? Because tourists will be very eager to go up again, and if there's no mechanism by which they can stop this flow from happening, it's gonna happen eventually. Yes, so is there an institutional mechanism to do that?
Well, the LGU is leading the talks and the consultations. It's more of a consultative process between the LGU, the local government, and the community, the tourism stakeholders. They have associations like SIHA. SIHA is Sagada Inns and Hotels Association. And they also have SEGA, the different guide organizations. So they're doing a consultative process in terms of planning for their tourism in the future after this pandemic. So I know that farm tourism is being considered. In fact, they have already started with some of their coffee farms, and that is going to be, I think, more emphasized after the pandemic. And now they're also more aware that the mass tourism is going to be more critical for them because they're not prepared for any positive case. We don't know when the pandemic is going to be over. there may be a time when the national government would say that tourism is now allowed to in the different provinces. But I don't think that Sagada would readily be opening the town to all tourists. That's why now they're going to, I know that they will be drafting some guidelines for tourism, and it's geared towards responsible and sustainable tourism and not mass tourism, because in one person who is a carrier can actually infect not just other tourists but the whole community, and they know that they don't have enough facilities. They are not prepared for any infection.
Thanks so much, Tracy. I think all these are very, very interesting thoughts. Our panelists and our people from Facebook have provided us a lot of inputs. And I think in closing, I thought that if we go back to the main question, what started it all is the pandemic. Do we really need a pandemic to change our mindsets? But maybe that was the starting point, but new changes are happening. And if we can focus on the rural and the artisanal, the small communities, and let's say push them forward so that they become more self-empowered, they become entrepreneurs in themselves, and we can have a better focus on their own culture and their own heritage, right? Food is just a small part of the whole cultural system that is related to food production. You have all the equipment, you have the knowledge, the intangible heritage. And I really like what Dr. Zialcita is saying about gastronomy, that we need to know the whole understanding of food. We need to appreciate that whole system so that once we market it outside and it becomes a knowledgeable product, you're proud of that food. So Chen's point of the national support is also very important. We can do a lot of things internally, but the national government will also need to provide that kind of support in the end. So I think that concludes our conversations. It is just a starting point for us. ICOMOS will be providing several webinars in the next couple of weeks that will be focused on the pandemic and some different strategies that will be providing provocations for heritage professionals and different stakeholders. And we hope that you will be part of that conversation. Give us more comments. We invite you to join us in many of our talks. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.